Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world, and thank you for your kind words of introduction. I'm a futurist. I don't really know what that means. I think we're all futurists because we all have to have a vision of the future in order to create the future, and that is what Wabtec is all about. So I'm going to take us on a journey into what that future might be. I work with many of the world's largest companies in just about every industry and every sector. So my question is, what happens if we take off the glasses of Wabtec and consider a wider future? I spent 6 hours of today on a train, not dissimilar to this one. And as soon as I came home, I was greeted by a 6-week-old grandson called Samuel. This isn't him, but I just want you to imagine him for a moment. And it made me think about what kind of rail world will Samuel grow up in 60 years' time, in 2082. That was my frame. And I started to consider that, as I say, from every aspect of where things are today and the nearer term future. And we already have, for instance, Google looking to reinvent itself as a travel company. We have travel and transport and freight companies looking to reinvent themselves as data companies. And then when we trail back into history, we see extraordinary things. You know, we think about the Janet coupler invented in 1873, yet still a current technology, an extraordinary innovation at the time, which has saved hundreds, maybe thousands of people from having terrible accidents coupling engines together. And I think about the technologies we're building now. What will be the technologies that Wabtec will be famous for in maybe 140 years' time? What will be the hallmarks? What will be the things that my son Samuel could find himself hearing about in 60 years' time that have become legends as a result of Wabtec innovation? So what is the life cycle of what we're talking about today? Well, we could have an innovation, hypothetically, that takes 5 years or more to come to market, maybe a lot more. That innovation, I imagine, could have a production life of 10 years, maybe more. But even if it is only a 10-year production life before it stops, we can imagine easily that the locos coming off the assembly line today may well be on some track somewhere in the world, even if it's in an emerging market, in 50 years' time. Beyond that, it may have had a refit or two, but that takes us straight away into the territory of my son Samuel. So come back to the question, what is the genius that Wabtec will be famous for when he's 60 years old, around 60 years old? Next question, how do we ensure ultra longevity in the products we're making so we don't have to call them back for radical refits in 10 or 15 years' time? In fact, we can re-engineer them relatively quickly, maybe in 25 years' time, and give them a further 25 years' life. What would be the maximum longevity that we could create out of our genius innovations with a hyper-modular approach? Now, I'll come back to blindness because, you know, I often eat in restaurants, and I'm sure you've had this experience as well. You go into a fantastic Michelin-star restaurant, but you just can't catch the waiter's attention. We've all had that experience. Strange, isn't it, that a restaurant should spend all its time preparing its food and menu and the rest and doesn't train a waiter to use their eyes. It costs nothing to train a waiter to look up and scan a room, and most waiters can scan a room at the speed of light. Bill, sweet, coffee. It saves so much time, it doubles the tips in their pocket, and it's enough to turn a Michelin-star restaurant from loss into profit, because most of the profit is in the second bottle of wine, the coffee, and the sweet. Yet it's easy to be blind, institutionally blind. As I say, so many restaurants make this silly mistake, which costs nothing to sort out. Here's another silly mistake. I know from a straw poll of thousands and thousands of executives around the world that around 40% of my audiences in the last 9 to 12 months, this was before COVID, had an accident in the shower. By mistake, they pulled the conditioner bottle rather than the shampoo bottle or the gel bottle and had a bath or a shower in conditioner. Why? Because they couldn't read the print on the side of the bottle. It's so small and they don't take their reading glasses into the shower. And, you know, you might think this is an isolated incident. It's universal. I did a poll of 800 CEOs of many of the largest hotel groups in the world, and they too were regularly having hair conditioner showers in their own hotels because of the same problem. How can it be How could they be so blind? They're experiencing the problems in their own hotels, in their own lives. Their customers are having this problem all the time. Why can't they print a little bit extra ink and make the words a bit larger? Easy to be blind. And usually it's the smaller companies that are clever in seeing these examples of institutional blindness. And I can imagine in the rail freight sector, in mining, in all kinds of areas of engineering, that we will see floods of startups doing extraordinary things. Most of them will die out. Some of them will be very smart and they'll take big risks and come to your attention, and you may end up buying in those innovations, and they may well be part of the answer of where that genius is going to come from, for which Wabtec will be truly famous in 60 years' time. It's true that stuff happens whatever sector you're in, especially in freight of all kinds. Big things happen, and they've been happening all around us. COVID is just one example. By the way, you're all going to get a signed copy of my book. I hope that many of you have already received it. And in this book, which I wrote originally in 2015, updated in 2019, I wrote about wildcard risks or wild swan events. On page 19, you'll see my number one warning of a serious risk was viral pandemic. So I've been predicting trends for a very long time. And what I can say is this: COVID has reminded us that strategies get overtaken by events. The world can change faster than Wabtec can hold a board meeting. So on the one hand, we've got the prospect of creating extraordinary magic, genius, innovations that could transcend generations, that people are still talking about in 100 years' time. On the other, we can find the entire sector overwhelmed by changes that are happening far faster than we had anticipated. So innovation is also going to be about agility. Now, here's a smashed railway line. This was a result of an earthquake in Japan. A 20-second event twisted those tracks, and another 20-second event smashed up a nuclear reactor. We know the rest of that story. As a direct result, energy policy changed in Japan and Germany. Both nations cancelled nuclear altogether, and that's happening, unfolding right now. But the other thing that happened, in the same month or two, China embarked on the biggest investment in nuclear in its history, and so did my country. So what we saw were two massively different reactions to the same individual event. And what we learned from this is that while all kinds of events happen, it's often the emotional reactions to the events that will shape an industry, shape regulation, shape public opinion. And if we want to know the future, therefore, of energy, for example, we need to look beyond just the science of global warming or green tech or so on, and we need to consider what's happening to public mood. The future, therefore, will be driven by emotion, not just innovation. And this will affect the rail sector. In fact, the rail sector will benefit, I predict, from all kinds of regulatory changes which favor rail over other solutions, because regulation costs very little for government. With one click of the finger, they can sign a piece of paper, and suddenly there are all kinds of new tariffs or restrictions and things like that. Industry has to bear the cost. Governments get very popular with their voters for doing the right thing. So expect all kinds of interesting changes, which I think will benefit Wabtec. Okay, what about Samuel, my grandson? Well, in 2080, I think it will still be cheaper to ship a container from my country to China than to truck it 200 kilometers over the road. Why? Well, just because of the laws of physics. It is so elegantly simple to push a massive weight through water compared to rolling rubber tires on roads. And in 2080, when my grandson is about 60, I also am convinced that long distance rail will still be at 10% of the cost of truck driving. So these are overwhelming physical issues that I think will remain. But the future of rail will not just be determined, unfortunately, by competing on cost for longer distance. We are already seeing tremendous pressures which have been exacerbated through COVID and other things to make supply chains much shorter, much sharper. In fact, in the United States, 67% of sourcing managers are considering reshoring their suppliers right now. I was in Minsk in Belarus not long ago, before the troubles there, and I saw a new car factory, and 50% of all the product in that car factory, which is Chinese, by the way, was manufactured in Minsk for the Russian market. So this is a micro push. This is a miniaturization of supply chains, and is actually very bad news for rail freight, which of course relies on distance. So we need to understand these macro issues that are going on. Now, at the end of the day, it's all about being easy, fast, reliable, low-cost ways to move products or people. It is as simple as that, and that will be the case in 6 years' time and 300 years' time. And if you want to know the future of manufacturing, for instance, I always say to my manufacturing colleagues, look at what you're doing in your own life. If you want to look at the future of rail freight, look at what you're doing in your own life. And the answer is that we all want the information all the time in our pockets, totally live, incredibly simple, absolutely instantaneous. Now, example of this, I ordered just before Christmas a tiny little toy I forgot for one of our grandchildren, and from Amazon, and it came delivered in a tiny plastic packet, but it clearly had traveled in that form all the way from China, yet it arrived in our house 5 days after I'd ordered it. So rail will continue to be in competition with these agile supply chains that are coming in through other means, in particular air. Now, of course, shipping would have been much too slow for me that Christmas. See, one of the things I've learned through advising large company boards for many years over the future is that most board debates are not about what's going to happen, which is usually fairly obvious if you've read books like mine. By the way, this is the book I wrote in 1998 called FutureWise. Its core messages are largely the same as my core messages here. Why? Because this was a 50-year view of the future written in 1998. This is a 2018 book with a 50-year view of the future. So we were only 20 years down the 50-year track when I wrote The Future of Almost Everything, which you're just about to receive. Big trends are unmistakable. They are shaping our future. And these big trends will fundamentally drive the future of rail. But there are big questions about timing of innovation. Now, of course, we've seen this with COVID about, whether the speed at which virtual working will continue to increase, or whether it'll level off and then go gradually up again as COVID eases and so on. The speed at which luggage becomes completely digitized for ordinary people as they travel. The way in which tracking technology migrates from people like Airbus to much smaller manufacturers and so on. How quickly it actually takes for rail freight to be completely integrated into the world of apps. It's still very patchy. But here's a very big driver, which is still going to be true in 25 years' time. 85% of our world now lives in emerging markets. And that is where almost all the economic growth is going to be, and a vast chunk of the infrastructure drive for rail investment. And 1% of the world owns 50% of global wealth. It's going to rise to 60% on current trends. So we have a concentration of wealth in a few people who own a lot of stocks of companies like Wabtec. But the drive, the real muscle of the world is going to be economic growth driven by the poorest parts of the world. Here's another big fact. We know for sure that 1 billion people will migrate from rural areas into cities over the next 30 years. Why? Because that's happened in the last 30 years, 30 years before. Really solid urbanization. And as it happens, most of them are arriving in places like this with very little infrastructure. So you can be certain that a gigantic investment will take place in the largest cities of the world to provide smaller scale urban rail systems, light rail, but also intercity traffic, freight, and so on. What would be the level of that? Well, it'll be certainly in place with global growth. And actually, just for the record, during the massive so-called economic crisis of 2009, 10, and 11, global growth hardly stopped. During the COVID crisis, global growth has hardly hardly faltered for a moment. And indeed, next year, we're expecting between 5-6% global growth economically, and slightly less than that the year after, a bit of catch up. Global growth will continue, driven by emerging markets, not by the United States economy primarily, or by the European economy, or Japan, or Canada, or Australia, or New Zealand. It'll be China, India, Malaysia, Singapore, Brazil, exciting countries like that, which are going to do tremendous things in terms of their own rail investment. And we're going to see gigantic scale. In the EU already, 50% of all retail spending is just in 10 companies. And you're going to see those trends towards mass consolidation of retail in every emerging market in the world. And just the same is going to happen over things like the provision of cars, the building of infrastructure, and investment in rail. Now, having said that, here is an interesting reality check when it comes to freight. If you look at, say, the United States and the state of New Mexico, last year, 84% of all exports from New Mexico to other states were from small companies. So again, we're back to the app-type world. It's the small distributor who at the moment is often locked out of the world of rail because it requires all kinds of thinking, infrastructure, organization, and processes which they just don't have. So that, I think, is going to be a very big change. Hyper automation at every point. And of course, when it gets on a truck, it'll be driven by a driverless vehicle. When it comes onto a train, by a driverless train, and so on. All kinds of changes. But I want to come back to COVID for a moment, because there's something else that's mega. Something else that I described in 1998 that's become a bigger force even in 2018, and it'll be one of the biggest drivers that impacts the business of Wabtec over the next 30 years. And it's been accelerated by COVID. What's that? It's the environment. It's the concern of ordinary people around the world about the environment. Here's a survey of just 10,000 people, 16 to 25-year-olds in 10 nations around the world. 60% of them say things like humanity is doomed and governments have betrayed future generations. And these are things which have become more accentuated. And while we can focus on CO2, I'll tell you, I think the big game changer in the future will be methane. Why is that? Methane is many times, 1,000 times or more potent as a global warming agent, or even though it doesn't last in the atmosphere for long. And if you think of what's happening in Siberia at the moment, there are places where you can tap the ground, drop a cigarette lighter and light and suddenly you get a flame which will burn maybe for hours. Methane bubbling up. We have more carbon in frozen methane than in all global coal, oil, and gas reserves in the world. So what happens with that bubbling methane as the world is warming is extraordinarily important. This is just one explosion that took place in Russia a couple of years ago. We have underground fires, which we call zombie fires, all over Siberia at the moment. They don't go out, they just get covered with ice and snow, and in the summer they flare up again. It's smoldering methane, smoldering, melting methane. Does it matter? Yes, it might. The reason why I'm saying this is that there are all kinds of anxieties already globally about global warming, but there are other aspects of the picture. And remember, I said the future is not so much about science, it's about emotion. It's about emotional reactions to the science. So here is another interesting fact. When you start to really think about rolling out scale, the kind of technologies we already have, then we get some startling results. We already have the technology to power the whole of Europe from just 20 kilometers times 80 kilometers of the Saudi desert. And I can tell you that the Saudi government are at present planning solar arrays many times this size. You might say, well, what a waste of time. What happens during the night? Well, I'll come to that. Or what happens rather during the day when you've got too much power? I'll come to that too. What it means is we could power the whole of the United States of America from 20 kilometers times 80 kilometers of desert if we could find a way to reliably capture our surplus power during the day and use it at night. Can we do it? Yes, we can. And we have the technologies now, by the way, to transmit power over maybe 5,000 kilometers with very little power loss. One of the things you're going to hear a lot more about is green power being used to create physical product, which can then be converted. And I'm not talking about charging batteries now. I'm talking about things like turning electricity into ammonia, which is, after all, it's just nitrogen and hydrogen, which can then be split into hydrogen very easily. Ammonia is easy to transport. It's not particularly explosive, but it can be burnt already. We know how to burn it in diesel type engines, which are specially adapted. We also know how to split ammonia into electricity. I'm talking about yesterday's technologies here. You tell me the future. You tell me how the use of ammonia in a combustion engine, the use of ammonia to generate electricity may have morphed over the next 20 years to help transform our world by the time Samuel is 80. I think about the announcement just last month in mid-January. I think it was around the 14th of January that Rio Tinto announced the purchase of 4 airfile X-drive locos. Yes, of course, traditional battery technology, but those batteries, very bulky compared to the amount of ammonia that you normally have to carry. And there are all kinds of issues here. Battery technology will be of fundamental importance. Electric powered locos using the overhead lines and the rest, fundamental importance, will probably be dominant in many parts of the world. But where there's very long tracks, as there is here, over very long distance with not many trains per day and so on, we will find all kinds of creative things going on, I believe, using the surplus power that we didn't know how to use otherwise from places like desert. And in the meantime, we'll be re-engineering other things too. So I sit on the board of a large multinational company which is building one of the largest stations in Europe, and we're aiming for carbon zero from that. This is an absolutely gigantic juggernaut trend, and it's going to go on. In the meantime, this is ridiculous. Talk about easy things to sort out with a little app. This is an opportunity for a 1 billion startup almost overnight. 30% of trucks in the US are running empty, as I'm sure you know, and it applies to containers being shunted around on railways, I'm sure as well. Now, of course, we can debate about the ways in which this is actually going to happen. So I come back to my question. What will be the genius that Wabtec will be famous for in 2018? That is my question. And I can tell you that I don't think the answer is going to be things like improvement in passenger comfort. I think we've pretty much optimized what seat shapes people have to have for the shape of people. And likewise, I don't think it's going to be radical improvements in the skin of a truck or its fire status or its ability to withstand explosions or things. We've sorted that kind of stuff out, I think, fairly well. No, I think it's going to come, the genius is going to come in how we move things around, how we control them, the automation, and what is more, how we integrate with every other way of moving things. But it'll all be about building a better world. So that's it. Back to you.
Have you thought of any new business models that you think will emerge? Some new services that will appear within freight or transportation that don't exist today?
Well, I suspect I've hinted at some of them. I think some of them are going to be quite playful integrators. They're just fantastic at integrating. 2 areas. Integrating regarding the sort of the retail experience, that is to make it so much easier for a very small exporter to suddenly find that packages are on a train, and not just on the train, but all the way through. And secondly, integrators in terms of technologies. These, the next generation and beyond of green tech is going to involve some awesome steps of courage to get this right. Yes, of course, everyone's going to have, there's nothing new about batteries and motors that are electric. It's a lot easier to build an electric motor than it is a running off a battery, than it is a great big diesel engine and all the rest of it running off, powering and so on. But beyond that, to get next generation ways of managing the power, getting the best out of the battery, next generation regenerative processes, and all kinds of very sophisticated stuff's going to happen. If I'm right about ammonia, for example, we're at stage nearly zero, I think, as regards getting that right. But it's already the case. I mentioned the construction company, and we are already we've made a decision to have no more diesel generators on site. It'll be either hydrogen or ammonia, which is another version probably of hydrogen by the time we get there. But it's moving very, very fast. And I think we're going to find shipping companies are changing to different kinds of fuel. Rail is a gift because we're not so worried about space or weight. We can do the experiments that you just can't do on a plane. It's just crying out to do some cutting edge experiments. And I suspect that there'll be innovations that come from shipping or from rail in terms of what drives the locos that become important innovations that may well spin out all kinds of other interesting opportunities for Wabtec technologies in other sectors. Now, that's always been Wabtec's genius, and think about your involvement in mining, for instance, and digital platforms and controls. And I think it's been very good, very, very interesting, the kind of sort of ancillary innovations that you develop as a group.
I have a question too. So that was a very interesting talk. So I'm just curious to know your thoughts about rail, passenger rails. So there's so much push for the development of roadways, and there's electric vehicles. So all in the road domain. What do you think of the current role of passenger rail, and what is the future for that?
Well, I'm going to focus my answer to that on emerging markets. If you think of my city of London, I mean, surprising any buildings stand up, the number of tunnels we've drilled under the city. But the Victorians started that process, over 100 years ago. It's very expensive to tunnel, as you know. It's crippling every time we do a new line. We have to go deeper and deeper, and it's just a very inefficient way. And of course, for today's equivalent of London, which is, let's say Kinshasa, a city like Kinshasa, or Nairobi, or Lagos, or Cartagena in Colombia, big cities, and think how big they're going to be in 30 years' time, 40 years' time, 50 years' time. We know the answer. It's unlikely that they're going to do vast amounts of tunneling. They've got an advantage. They can see the future. The Victorians couldn't. They just made it up as they went along and hoped for the best. They could only imagine it. But these countries are going to play 150 years of rail catch-up in 20 years. So how do you do that? Well, you have to do it on stilts. You go up, which of course, so we're going to see an explosion of light railways, literally light, because you don't want to build a very high, heavy structure to hold them up. Light railways on stilts that go around over whatever's there, whether it's the houses, the factories, the schools, the colleges, and other roads. So light rail would be absolutely critical to this. And associated with that would be what I would call hybrid buses, where it's buses that can be on track or they can be on a road. The most marvelous thing about buses, they're the quickest way to revolutionize transport in any city, because it costs nothing to create a new bus route. You just buy a bus, put a number on it, and print a map, and off it goes. But if you can have hybrid buses, which are also able to utilize tracks, I think that'll be an interesting innovation too. So bus technology is going to be absolutely critical, rail technology absolutely critical, and community-owned car vehicles. By that, I mean, it's the next generation of one. These are automatically driven vehicles. The days of owning a vehicle, very last century. They're running around town all the time. They know when you need one. They're there within seconds. You jump in and they take you to your next destination. So I think those kind of things in combination. But the world would have to have 4 times as many cars on the roads as it has today if the world as a whole was to reach the same level of car ownership as the United States. It is already impossible to imagine in many of the world's densest centers of megacities. So the idea of people having individual cars and careering around the place is not only antisocial and horrible from the point of view of noise and wasted time and congestion and parking issues, but it's incredibly wasteful from the environmental point of view. It's incredibly destructive and inefficient. So we are going to see individual ownership of cars by 2050, 2060. I think we'll find them more or less taxed out of existence in inner cities. are people being forced to use. It's not you can't have an individual ride in a car, it's just that you can't own it. The moment you're out of that car, it's used by someone else. And very, very efficient. So actually the reason for actually having to have one in your garage would be just so weird. So I think it's a combination of those things. Now, which ones of those are really good for Wabtec? Well, of course, Wabtec's going to morph all over the place. You think, that you're now a product of three big companies, each with their own heritage, their own history, and their own spectacular innovations, which each of those three companies has been famous. Put all that genius together, and what could Wabtec become? That's so exciting. And I think that about other acquisitions that will come, I've already said you'll gobble up, I'm sure, a large number of small startups along the way and middle-sized companies to build the engines, literally the engines of growth for the future for you. And I think that you'll find yourself, I'm sure, by 2050, having diversified all over the place to maximize the technologies that you had and applying them into different areas, different regions, different countries, different sectors.
Thank you. Thank you.
Have you got time for one more question if there is one?
Yeah, I can go ahead and ask a question to complete the trifecta of questions from each of us. You talked about looking at innovation, and you talk about the acquisition of kind of small and medium sized companies. I think which historically Wabtec has done, even acquiring large companies like what was GE Transportation. And I'm more curious, that's one way of innovating, but there's also the way of kind of incubating innovation within a company and within the talent that's inside. So just curious about whether it's experience you have working with these large companies. How have you seen success being built internally within a company to grow and foster innovation and have the ideas start from the company itself rather than from outside?
It's interesting. It was a global survey not long ago of CEOs of many of the world's most innovative companies. And they asked them one question: what is the single greatest key to driving innovation? And you know what it was? Diversity. I said at the beginning how easy it is to be blind. So I'm coming back to that and closing off with that thought. It's very easy. This is the reason why it's hard to innovate inside a large organization, because we have ways of doing things, ways of thinking. We have our existing technologies and processes, and sometimes someone coming in with something that could cannibalize what we're already doing. These things are uncomfortable and hard to imagine. But diversity is the key to this, because it brings in oxygen. It's the reason why, for instance, someone like myself is speaking at now rather than in this particular slot rather than another person from Wabtec, because you got the Wabtec view already. So the value comes from inviting people into your teams, recruiting people who are not, let's say, core rail freight people. They haven't had a history in mining tech. They don't eat, sleep, and breathe diesel engines in rail locomotives. They may have had background in that. They may have all kinds of engineering and skills and digital, whatever, but they're coming fresh, and they're coming with permission to be uncomfortable provokers, and with a budget to be within an entrepreneurial team, which is given space to innovate. And I think that's really, really important. So it's diversity and space and permission to fail. It can't. If we're under pressure, our bonus, every innovation's got to succeed this year. You've already killed the innovation team, because they're never going to produce anything that's dangerous. They'll only produce things that are basically tiny iterations of what they already know works, because they want to get that bonus at the end. So innovation, I think, really depends on this. And, each of the three constituent pillars of Wabtec's strength will continue to do that, I'm sure.
Wonderful. Thank you.
And finally, just to say, if any of you would like to communicate with me, my email address is in the back of the book. My mobile phone number is there. My LinkedIn, Twitter, and everything else. All I'd say is, if you do send me a note and I'm a bit slow to answer, be kind to me, because on my website, if you go there, globalchange.com, you'll find that there's 15 million individuals who've been there before you, and there's an awful lot of them still on the site. So, and they all have my addresses too and phone number. So If I haven't replied to you in short order, take a deep breath, wait 48 hours and send again. But I look forward to continuing conversation with anyone who would like to do so. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.